About that, the bot doesn't seem to be working anyway, so this should be fine. Hello everyone, welcome. Tonight, is that how you pronounce it? Sorry.
It's Hakim.
Okay, great. A short introduction about yourself.
Sure thing. A Marxist Leninist on YouTube, you could say. I am a physician. I side hobby, you could say. Yeah, no introduction. I'm from Iraq, if that's of any help.
Okay, excellent. We'll just get straight into the questions from our user base. But is that all right with
you? Fine.
Okay, start. Probably Tim. Do you see capitalism more as something which is just on our road to socialism?
That's a very interesting question. Minor side note, because I always forget. I'm sure that this Q&A or so, and then afterwards I'll have to get going. Question, then please feel free. My DMs are always open for any of them as soon as I can. So
through all of these tonight because there's quite.
I guess that's the question is capitalism. Could you actually repeat it for me?
So probably Tim asks more as an evil or more intermediary stage on our road to.
I think when we think about the development, we need to remember that at one point, of course, that era of and it has outlived its use. When we say, for example, you could say so in the form of policy sort of sphere, sort of state capitalism for developed stuff, early Soviet Union, like the one that was instilled and championed by. That's one aspect. Many countries that emerge from men's also do require a level of capitalist development in order to then later on begin. It becomes part of the concept of new democracy by Mao incorporates this aspect. But, though, a necessary evil. I don't like moralist arguments personally. What is the issue with capitalism more or less is its predication on, or it's like centering in on the idea of infinite growth on a finite planet with finite resources. This is something that is irreconcilable. You can't reconcile this point. There's no way to make it work. Another one is, for example, the falling rate of profit. These are issues that can be mitigated to an extent, but can never be completely eliminated. You can't get around the fact that the rate of profit has a tendency to fall. You can't make a, let's say, quote unquote, conscious capitalism that will take into account the limitations of the earth and resources and whatnot, on and on. So when we say it like this, it's a much more empirical statement that capitalism isn't that it isn't that it's evil, but it's that it's unsustainable. And that's, I think, the fundamental gripe that socialists have with the system.
Okay, thank you. Really good answer. Staying on that topic, our next question, I should probably preface, I'm not the one that's asking these questions. These are all from our user base, so don't come at me if you think I'm mischaracterizing you or anything like that, because that's not my intention.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine, don't worry, go ahead.
Excellent. So this next question comes from Ravenwolf, and they ask, do you think that class as a tool for a material analysis is becoming less relevant as the lines between classes become blurred and it becomes easier for all members of society to own shares in a business?
That's actually a very interesting question. One thing to say is that that question somewhat underpins a slight misunderstanding of Marxian positions. If you own shares in a company, let's say, that doesn't change your overall relations to the means of production. That's what defines what your class is. So you are proletarian because you have to sell your labor power in return for a wage. You don't have means of production that you hire people out and make profit off of, surplus value that's produced on and on. What you do, just generally, if you're a proletarian, is you have to sell your labor power in return for a wage. Now, you can be a member of the proletariat and also still have some small amount of shares, but that doesn't fundamentally alter your relations to the means of production. So just because you own some shares doesn't change the fact that you're a proletarian. That's number one. Number two, though, is very interesting. Now, a lot of people who, even this is an error even some Marxists make, class is very, very, very important. I can't understate this. Class is incredibly important, but it isn't the only thing. And that's where some people with mistaken perspectives or maybe deterministic perspectives, they consider class to be the end all and be all of all analysis that can be done. As Marxists, our analysis should first and foremost emanate from a position of class, but we should also intersect other things like gender and sex, racial relations, even cultural aspects. All these can intersect to form a coherent and eclectic approach towards analysis. So to say that the lines are being blurred, I would not say so. They're still relatively clear. You can still establish class origins and class interests based on proper analysis. The only thing that's missing, and I think that's where the misunderstanding stems from, is the proper approach, let's say, where you also allow for intersections of other equally important aspects in some regards, like, for example, gender and sex, like, for example, race, on and on.
Oh, that's a really good answer. Thank you. This next one, moving away from the topic of capitalism, comes from Medieval Comrade, and they ask, "What is your opinion on the Arab Socialism movement in the late 50s and 60s that was spearheaded by President Nasser, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and his attempt to unify Arabic countries under the Arab Republic?"
Don't worry, you pronounced it perfectly. So the general approach of the Arab Socialists of the middle of the previous century, it is almost correct, and they achieved quite a bit, but also failed in many regards. My general opinion of them is it was a laudable attempt, but one of the many reasons that they failed was fundamentally because many of the Arab Socialist tendencies, you can say, that weren't explicitly Marxist, like for example, Nasserism, or for example, Ba'ath, like the Ba'ath Party and stuff like that, and Ba'ath ideology. They rejected class struggle. They did agree with certain, let's say you can say, almost economistically deterministic. No, what's the English word for this? Actually, sorry. Sometimes this happens where my English fails me, and I
That's okay.
yeah. In case people don't know this, English is my second language, so sometimes it does fail. What I'm trying to say is they agreed with the economic, let's say, directives or administrative things that were done in other countries, like in the Eastern European countries, and they tried to replicate them. But they did not fundamentally have a correct ideological position. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that a lot of them, for example, would nationalize industry, which is good. They would try to collectivize agriculture to an extent, not as much as, for example, the socialist countries did, but to an extent, which is equally good. But when you do this without having a proper approach to, for example, the workplace, like on the micro level, like reorganization of workplaces, the formation of cooperatives, for example, on one level, like on the agricultural sector, or the formation of like working councils in factories. This is on one segment. On another segment, you also have the error that is the rejection of the class struggle, which basically means that it approaches at the position of class collaborationism, meaning that, it doesn't matter if we have a member of the Arab proletariat or a member of the Arab bourgeoisie. We're all Arabs together, and we should kind of like develop things together forward and blah blah blah. This is a mistaken idea because the fundamental interests are diametrically opposed. And as a result, this can cause issues along the lines of, for example, giving too much power to the national bourgeoisie. Because they were anti-colonial ideologies in the first place, they rejected foreign capitalists for the most part, which is a good thing. But they gave too much reign to national, to almost, which would become eventually confederal bourgeoisie. This was seen in Egypt, for example, to an extent. This was seen in the North African republics, in Algeria and Tunisia, for example. And this mistaken position is fundamentally arises from their rejection of the class struggle. That's kind of the point I'm trying to highlight. Other than that, it was an impressive attempt. They achieved a lot of good things. They managed to do a lot of good for, like, for example, education level of the population, for women's rights, on and on. But at the end, the reason they failed was mainly because they lacked the correct ideological line, as well as, of course, these progressive anti-colonial regimes were against Western interests and Western imperial interests in particular. And as a result, they were combated, whether they be in Libya, for example, or Iraq to an extent, or Syria, or Egypt at the time, on and on. I hope that was somewhat of a scattered answer, but I hope it kind of clarifies my position.
Yeah, that was a great answer. Staying on the topic of Arabic nations, our next question also comes from Medieval Comrade, and they ask, how do you see the Arab Spring, and how should have it been done, according to your opinion, in order to achieve a real change?
The fundamental issue of the Arab Spring was that it was a spontaneous movement. Not that there's anything wrong with spontaneous movements, but the primary issue wasn't on the people's side, it was on the leftist parties of the region. Now, this is, if we want to color it in Maoist terminology, we would say that they were trailing behind the people, these leftist parties or Marxian parties, socialist parties, whatever you want to say. What this means is that normally when you have a spontaneous movement, like the July Days is a good example if you want to, like, October Revolution, or not October Revolution, but I mean Russian Revolution example. When the population is a bit ahead of the party, this is a fundamental failing of the party itself for not properly analyzing the situation and directing this righteous outrage, you can say, in a more productive direction. And that's fundamentally why the Arab Spring failed, because there were no coherent political institutions and groups that represented the desires of the people, particularly of the workers, and had a proper avenue of getting those things done. That's the fundamental issue. Other than that, it becomes a much wider question of how diverse the protests were, the extent in different countries, and all that. But the fundamental issue was that there was no proper political leadership, particularly from a left-wing perspective. Yeah, that's about that.
Okay. The next question comes from Hacked Duck, and they want to know, what are some of the shortcomings of the Iraqi Communist Party?
How long do you have? So okay, I'm gonna just what's the term in English? Quick fire them. Yeah, I'm just gonna say a couple quickly. So number one, the Central Committee has been completely ossified. It's the same people for the past 30 years, and they refuse to leave their positions, even though nobody really cares about them. That's number one. Number two, they do not have properly educated cadre. Number three, even if they had properly educated cadre, there is no political work being done by the Iraqi Communist Party whatsoever. It's practically nothing what they do. Number four, they've never had or developed a proper political program for Iraq. The last time a somewhat decent political program of the Communist Party was developed was maybe in 1952. Ever since then, nothing decent has been made. Furthermore, I think, and a fundamental issue is that they collaborated with the American and particularly the coalition government, but specifically the NATO invasion of Iraq. They did not only collaborate, they were enthusiastic collaborators, and that is basically traitors in our midst, is what that makes them. Amongst many, many other issues, but I think those are fundamentally why they fail. And I think the most glaring of which is that there's no party work being done by them. It's just vague political collaborationism with different sorts of unsavory groups that quickly falls apart and never really amounts to anything, like what happened with Muqtada Sadr a couple of years ago now at this point, since it's 2021. But yeah, so you understand what I'm trying to say. So those are some of the many, many faults.
Okay. And staying on the topic of kind of parties, Kale Chan would like to know, what are your thoughts on the corruption with the Iraqi government right now?
Yes. The reason that this has occurred is because the central government in Iraq is incredibly weak. I remember there's something kind of funny about. I watched a documentary once about Sierra Leone, and it was interviewing a warlord in Sierra Leone, and he commented half jokingly, he was like, "I could take a bunch of men in 2 weeks. I could take power in Sierra Leone, basically." And as funny as that sounds, it's almost the same situation in Iraq. I say this half jokingly. I mean, it would take more than 2 weeks and more than a bunch of guys, but it is possible. The reason the central government is weak is because, by design, that the American invasion specifically intended for there to be a weak Iraqi administration. But not only this, after the Americans' kind of leftist power vacuum was quickly filled by Iranian proxies and not only direct Iranian forces, but forces very loyal to Iran. And as a result of this, what we have is basically a push and pull of the central government by all these different sides, which include, for example, NATO interests and particularly American interests in Iraq, Iranian interests, Gulf country interests in Iraq, even to some extent Turkish interests in Iraq, and also local militia interests. And every person who wants a little bit out of the central government, comes around and tries to basically bully them and push them around. Now, with this happening, basically, and also the supreme incompetence of the people that are put in power by by proxy of the true ruling groups of Iraq, which include mostly Iranian influence, but other ones too. These people are basically a face, and then they realize that in their current position, they can basically just steal as much as they want because they're going to be out in 2 months, because that's what happens in Iraqi politics. Nobody stays; everybody's out very, very quickly, and there's rapid rotation of ministers and then prime ministers in particular, but ministers and mayors and whatnot. So that's a very generic and general answer as to why. If there are way deeper issues with corruption in Iraq, but that's one small aspect that I hope can give somewhat of an inkling as to why it is the case.
Yeah, that was a really good answer. This next question comes from Rockpile. It's moving away from the kind of Iraqi focus questions, and they want to know, what are your recommended first couple of pieces of theory for one to read?
Sure thing. Maybe take a like notepad thing up or something so you can note them down, or you can just listen to this again once it's recorded. I'll give a very basic overview. From Marx, you should read his economic pamphlets first, which means wage, labor, and capital, and value, price, and profit. These are the two that you should read. From Engels, you should read Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, as well as his very short pamphlet titled The Principles of Communism. From Lenin, you should read State and the Revolution and Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. From Stalin, these are kind of you don't have to read these. I personally don't think they're necessary. A lot of people do, though. That's why I'm including them. The Foundations of Leninism by Stalin is pretty decent, as well as his short essay, Dialectical and Historical Materialism. I personally don't think you need to take a look at these, but many people consider them so, and they're decent on their own. After this, then you should read from Mao on practice, on contradiction, on the correct handling of contradictions amongst the people, oppose book worship, and combat liberalism. This is a very basic outline, and this will give you a solid foundation Marxist theory, so you can go on, read further, and not be totally lost with the things you read, as well as kind of allow for a nice springboard for whatever further reading, so you can have somewhat of a Marxian analysis if you want to employ it, particularly on the economic sphere. Other than that, I also have a book recommendations playlist, not necessarily only theory centered. There's some history, there's some sociology, stuff like that on my channel, so just check out my playlist. And if you have any specific recommendations you'd like, then just feel free to DM me, and I'll try to help you if I do know some books that could help out.
Great, okay. So staying on the topic of kind of your videos, our next question comes from Tan, and they want to know, in your video on libertarian socialism, you claim there to only be a semantic or aesthetic difference between libertarian and authoritarian socialism. Is there not a legitimate difference between the two, such on topics like the legality of same-sex marriage, something heavily repressed during the days of Stalin?
That's a very good question. When we talk about the issue that's happening here is it's a relativist issue, because we're applying our modern understanding of things to the understanding of things like 100 years ago. When we talk about authoritarian, libertarian, it's not entirely semantic. I was just kind of trying to bring a point forward. I even discuss it later on in the second half of the video about some material differences that could be there, but it depends pretty much on issues of pragmatism. But when we're talking about social issues and political, legislative issues, like, for example, same-sex marriage and whatnot, quote-unquote authoritarian people are not let me say this properly. Marxists or Marxist Leninists, which most people would identify as authoritarian, even though I personally disagree with this label, they are across the board in favor of full rights for trans people, for LGBT people of all stripes, on and on. The reason that in the interwar period in the Soviet Union, so in the 30s and 40s of the Soviet Union, the reason they had those issues with homosexuality was because at the time the medical consensus was that it was a mental disease. Nowadays we understand that this is completely wrong. Nowadays we understand that this is not a mental disease, it's something that's natural, and it's just part of a human inclination, on and on. And as a result, we will correct our line and apply proper analysis to the situation, and realize that as the science has developed, and as we now have a better understanding of what, for example, LGBT people and their sexual inclination, for example, or their gender identity, or what have you, now that we understand that this is something completely natural, it is not only incorrect for a Marxist to be against those things. It is, how can I even say this? It's not only, it's just outright, you cannot be a Marxist if you completely reject these things across the board like this, for example. Mm-hmm. So the reason that back in the day they did this thing was because of the understanding at the time. Now we know that it's completely different, and we correct our line appropriately. I hope that answered the question. If you want further clarification, or have a further question, just write it and I'll gladly answer.
Yeah, I think that was a really good answer. Now, for this next question, I understand you've made a few videos on this, but for some of the people who may not have seen your content before, Hacked Duck wants to know, do you think market socialism, as practiced in China or Vietnam, is a legitimate way of building socialism, or is it revisionist?
That's a lovely question. Let me preface it like this. Is it a legitimate way of building socialism? Yes. Having a quote-unquote market socialism is a legitimate way of building socialism. Now, is it socialism? Is a market socialist economy a socialist economy? I personally do not think so. The most generous way you can call it socialism, this is kind of bending the definition of socialism, is you have a communist party administering a state capitalist economy with the use of markets in order to raise the level of the productive forces. This is as best as you can get in calling it socialism. But if we were to be wholly honest, it is not socialism economically, but it can be labeled socialism as a transition, because we're we're building socialism slowly, right? And since the goal ends up being socialism and the road that we're down is towards socialism, it could be technically called that. Is it revisionist? It depends. What, for example, some countries are doing can be considered revisionist to some and not revisionist to others. My personal perspective, for example, when it comes to Vietnam, let's say, and their market socialist reforms, it is not about questions of revisionism and more questions of pragmatism and necessity. They need a proper outlet for their economic development. They're a very poor third world country. They can't stick to somebody's perception of, let's say, theoretical purity and stay poor. If what they need to do in order to sufficiently develop their economic structures and productive forces to develop them outside of this feudal existence that they've had for so long, they may need to make use of market mechanisms. Lenin advocated for this in the early Soviet Union, for example, with the NEP, and it was a correct thing to do at the time. There are some people who argue that what China is doing now could be considered similar to the NEP, just extended. These are things that can be discussed. We can all have conversations on this. There are sides to every story, all that kind of stuff. But when we talk about, my main point is, let's not be dogmatic with it. Let's not have discussions of revisionism or not without doing the proper analysis first. And when we look at the proper analysis and see, did these people have any other alternative, for example, or is this really the best way for them to develop as it currently stands, on and on, then afterwards we can have this conversation. So just short answer, I think it is a legitimate way of improving the economic forces of a country and developing socialism overall, but I do not consider market socialism per se to be socialist.
Okay. This next question comes from Awaken, and they want to know, how do you think Marxism has changed and adapted to fit the modern era compared to earlier forms of itself?
That's a very interesting question. Marxism is an incredibly flexible school of thought, we can say. When you say how has it changed to adapt to the modern situation, well, this is an incredibly broad question, because in every regard it has adapted. The issue, I think, or the idea, the perception that Marxism is more rigid and doesn't adapt, is because some people are not that aware of all the literature that exists, and they are stuck on basically just thinking that Marxism and Islam are all that was ever written. I've been noting these works actually for a while, but I can mention them again here. For example, when we talk about concepts of labor aristocracy and value transference, which is something it's kind of a little hobby of mine right nowadays, the works of Zach Cope, for example, the works of Suwandi, the works of Samir Amin, all of these have been done within the past 2 decades. Samir Amin's last book was published in 2011, even though he died in 2006. Zach Cope's last book was published in 2019. Swandi's book was published in 2019, for example. So all these things, this is a modern, modern, let's say, developments of Marxian theory and analysis, which is also highly empirical, for example, in the particular works I've just noted. So it has in many regards. The question is, what aspect do you want to highlight in particular? And then I can tell you how it has in this one form, or maybe recent works in this area, on and on.
Okay, really good answer. Our next question comes from Shen the Turk, and they ask, "What's your opinion on Saddam Hussein?"
Yes. Saddam Hussein, he was a very complicated figure. He was not particularly good, excuse me. But it can be said that he's better than what we currently have in Iraq now. And by Saddam, I don't particularly mean Saddam Hussein himself. What I mean is the Ba'ath administration of Iraq. And I'll highlight, I think, three aspects that can kind of put this point forward. The first of which is the stability of the country. Now, even then, even under the Ba'ath administration, it wasn't the most stable country on earth, but it was still relatively stable. You could live a relatively stable life. That's not the situation now. Second point is the issue with, for example, education and employment and women's rights and stuff like that. The Saddam government or the Ba'ath administration was far better on these things than the current administration is. Nowadays, it's completely normal to have wages be months late. It's completely normal to not have any sort of utilities. It's ridiculous that nearly 2 decades after the invasion, we still have electricity going out for most of the day, and this is especially dangerous in places where you need electricity all the time, like, for example, in hospitals. This was an issue less, how do I say this in English? A small proportion. This was a smaller issue. There were still power outages, for example, during the Ba'ath administration. But the thing is, at that time, there were some of the worst, if not the most severe sanctions on earth, economic sanctions on earth, being placed on Iraq. Now, Iraq has no sanctions on it, and it still can't provide. Not only can it not provide, it's doing even worse. So that's one aspect. Education is another one of those. Literacy rates, particularly for women, have plummeted. Various things to this effect. Basically, what I'm saying is water is another one, like having adequate access to clean drinking water. This has been a big issue, particularly in rural areas in Iraq. But even in large urban centers like in Baghdad, it's a big issue still. This is like the second point. And the third point that I'd like to highlight is sectarianism. Under the Ba'ath government, there was a very strong hand keeping all these forces at bay and protecting minority groups. For example, Christians and Mandians, two minorities in Iraq, religious minorities in Iraq, were very well protected under the Ba'ath regime. Compare that to now, where something like, I don't know, a very large percentage of the Christian minority of Iraq has left Iraq now because of the sectarian violence that's been going on. Mandians are practically disappearing from Iraq. Sunnis have been kicked out of their regular homes, and if you are interested in seeing this, for example, you just take a look at a sectarian map of Baghdad from like 2002 and now, and you'll see that Baghdad, which was a very nicely split city, if I want to say that, where you had Christian communities, you had Sunni communities, you had Shiite communities, Mandian, Kurdish communities, on, and now you look at it and it's practically like 90-95% Shiite. Everybody else who was not of the main religio-ethnic group, you could say, has had to leave or just change the way they live in some regard. So that's the general point is, when it comes to less so on Saddam and more so on the Ba'ath government of Iraq, it wasn't the best thing. It wasn't even particularly good, but it was better than what currently exists in Iraq. And that is, a very sad fact to have to know.
Okay, really good answer. Our next question comes from May, and they want to know, what do you think the American left should do other than educate, agitate, and organize, since CPUSA is closer to the progressive wing of the Democrats than communists, and PSL has no influence?
Yes. I remember I spoke about this in my conversation with Vosh. A couple of things need to be done. Number one is the building up of mutual aid and community organizing groups. That's first and foremost. Use the example of the Black Panthers for this. Number two, and this is, I think, the most important aspect for me, is to build and maintain anti-war and anti-imperialist movements in the United States. Because I think the best chance that the American left has, aside from just concessions, that they could get, like, let's say universal healthcare may be a possibility down the road somehow, but like socialism outright is a difficult sell, I believe, especially at the current state of political development of the United States. But that could change, and I'm not American, so Americans would know better about this. So that's why you guys should have your conversations amongst yourselves. But my personal perspective is you should develop anti-war and anti-imperialist movements to support third world movements as much as you can, because what that will result in is a breaking up of value chains and this international reserve army of labor, you could say, that the United States is dependent on. Not only this, but of course all cheap sources of, well, everything that the United States is dependent on. As a result of this, this will force the ruling classes, or the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie of the United States, to have to reorient inwards. That would heighten the class struggle and allow for greater opportunities for political action in the United States. I think these are my two main issues, well, main points. Other than that, you could have some tactical participation in of course, in elections. You can have some level of course, you should always agitate and educate and organize, like the person mentioned, on and on. But I think my general point is clear, I hope.
Yeah, of course. And staying on that kind of topic of America, Tan wants to know, why wouldn't you vote for Joe Biden in 2020, even as a form of damage control?
I don't think I would say I wouldn't vote for him. First of all, I'm not American, and that's the main kind of point I'd like to highlight. I do not know what the American experience is like. I don't know what being in American society is like. I don't know what the American political system is like in person. On and on. All I know is from what I read and from like news sources and stuff. So this was my recommendation in the videos to Vosh, where I kind of discussed this issue. My point is, it doesn't matter what I think or who I would vote for, because I can't vote for, because I don't have the necessary information and background for this. You, as Americans, if the person I'm replying to is an American, you as an American, if you personally consider it to be more beneficial to vote for Biden than not to vote at all, for example, then that is your prerogative, and this is something that you should do. My point is that if there were to be a blanket statement like that communists should vote for Joe Biden, for example, this should be something that should be discussed amongst the American radical left overall. There should be debates and discussions over this, and then once a democratic consensus is reached on this issue, then it can be followed through. My general point is, if you think it's a positive thing to do, then do so. Engaging in electoral politics in the United States in whatever form, do so, but it should not be the majority of your political work. In fact, it should be a very small minority. Do vote if you want to, but also you should agitate, educate, organize. You should try to develop community organizations and so on and so forth. You should try to advocate for movements that are abroad as well as internally. You should try to drive legislative change if you can in other methods, not just by trying to push, through Congress and stuff like that. On and on. These are my fundamental points.
Really good answer. Our next question comes from Boop, and they want to know, as an Iraqi, do you think LGBT rights will ever become popular, or at least not taboo within Arabic countries?
It was a very interesting question. Let me tell you a bit about the history. When we talk about LGBT communities, you'd find out, if you look into it historically, you'd find that our lands, being the quote-unquote Islamic lands, the Orient, who, as some put it, were traditionally very accepting. Not accepting, that's not the correct word, because that's kind of colored by something. But I mean, there was a place for these people in our societies historically. And when European travelers would come, they would be almost outraged. They would, with their pearl clutching at how such debauchery is allowed in these lands, and they would try to, psychoanalyze Arabs and Muslims as being lecherous and lewd people who are always associated with, on and on, right? When colonization occurred and when colonial regimes began to form or write up the constitutions and laws of these countries, like Syria, Egypt, on and on, they included their own very anti-LGBT rules and laws that existed at the time. And what this resulted in is, post-independence, this made it so that these laws also carried through into the new constitution, secular constitutions, and the legal systems of these newly independent nations. That's one. And another thing, there has been a westernization of the LGBT community or identity recently. I'm saying over the past maybe 50 years. And as a result of this, It has been a kind of a focal point, where I'm sure you've heard the term pink imperialism, so something like that, like trying to imperialize a country by framing it as, oh, we actually want to liberate the women in that country, or we actually want to help the gays in that country. And that doesn't help the image exactly of these groups in these countries. But now that they are somewhat, or to a very unpleasant extent, homophobic or anti-LGBTQ, certain political changes need to occur, and these need to be part of working class organization or political groups or parties programs. As the question was, do I think it will change? I think an acceptance will be reached, but I don't know if an outright celebration of it would ever happen. But I could be wrong. I don't know. Life is very surprising, can take some interesting turns. I can recommend 2 books on this that can be interesting. There is a book by Khalid Rouhaib, I think is his name. Its title is Before Homosexuality in the Islamic Arabic World, which discusses these perspectives on homosexuality in these countries prior. And the second work I can recommend is Yusuf Masood's Desiring Arabs, it's called. And that one talks about the concept of the westernization of the LGBT community and the colonial laws and whatnot in a lot more detail. So I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
That's a really good answer. Thank you. Our next question comes from Timelist, and they ask, what is your opinion on the AANES of Rojava and the Zapatistas of Mexico serving as a modern model for socialism in the third world in the future?
Yes. Yeah. So these are 2 very different groups, and I need to somewhat divide them because the Zapatista, or the EZLN, or EZLN, is on one side and Rojava is on the other. Just to break the myths that exist, Rojava is not an example of socialism and never has been. Rojava, as it currently exists, is nothing more than a proxy force used by the United States. And all the political progress, quote unquote, that some people think they haven't made. They just have very good PR, and they know what they need to show more left-leaning white people in other countries in order to get money out of them. I have family in that part of Syria. I know people who have traveled extensively in that area. I have comrades that have been to northern Syria, and the entire consensus that I've always gotten is it's nothing but a bunch of Kurdish nationalists, not exactly politically educated, definitely not in Marxism for sure, who want to basically maintain this quasi semi-independent position they currently have. And their secondary position is that of a proxy force for the United States. That's why, for example, they've occupied different natural gas fields, even though their stated mission was to basically protect Kurdish people originally. They've far extended that those borders and are now in areas that are completely, entirely Arab, and nothing aside from basically it served no political motive to take over those natural gas and very small oil fields that exist, for example, in the eastern part of Syria, other than what the United States wants. Generally, though, when you do see ideas or people trying to say that was socialism or there's something progressive going on there, the Kurdish population of northern Syria is one of the most, if not the most conservative, socially conservative group in all of the Middle East, and this has not changed against Rojava, nor are they making any active attempts at changing this. That's point number 1, and point number 2. There is no concept of socialism happening because there's no production happening in that area at all. The idea that there's some sort of horizontal organization and some mythical anarchist, none of that is there. You have a very tense, let's say, political authority, very centralized political authority, I might add, that's being held together only by military force. That's it. So I sorry to disappoint on this factor, but Rojava is not a example to really uphold generally. As for the EZLN, they, although what they tried to do in the early 90s was, let's say, it's something that should have, at the time, people should have cheered for. It is a laudable thing that they tried to do. It never got anywhere. the EZLN have just carved out a very small area for them where they have also a semi-independent, let's say, semi-independent political control, and they have just kind of a small understanding, you could say, with the central government, where they're not going to really bother them. But if tomorrow some level of resources was discovered in Chiapas, they are going to be wiped out, and they will have no way of defending themselves. Marx said that an insurrection that goes on the defensive is a dead insurrection, and that's exactly what kind of occurred. They tried to have a much larger, let's say, movement, and it failed spectacularly. And as a result of that, they worked out this kind of understanding with the central government, where the only reason they exist is because of this understanding with the central government. If they want to get rid of them tomorrow, they could. So to say that these would be, let's say, a example for socialism in the third world in the future, I do not think so in the least. They have shown to be limited in their scope. They have shown to be, particularly in the Rojava case, for example, only possible because of much bigger political events happening around them, as a point. So yeah, I think if you want to really take a look at examples that could be possible, the Chinese example from the half of the previous century, where you have a somewhat united front, where with some level of maintenance with the small producers and petty bourgeois, and even to some level national bourgeoisie, with a concept of new democracy and a communist party at the helm with a people's army, all that kind of stuff. That is a much more reliable and secure form of socialism that can be defended, number one, and secondly, can be developed compared to those other ones. That was a very long answer, I think, but I hope I actually I gave some clarity.
Yeah, that was a really, really good answer. Our next question comes from Hacked Duck, and they ask, what made you want to become a doctor?
Well, several things. I don't want to paint myself as some romantic, but one segment of it was that I did want to help people, but also it made me realize, and this kind of informs my political beliefs, that being a doctor you can only help several people at a time, and in your lifetime you're going to help a very small percentage of people. If you truly want real help, particularly in the medical sphere, you need political power, and what that means is you need proper administration of a health system that is not for profit but based on need, that's oriented towards prevention of disease rather than just curative or symptomatic things like this. So what really made me want to be a doctor was a lot of things: cultural expectations, family expectations, one of them. On another segment or section, you could say, is my own personal convictions for trying to help people. And on a third, it's also my personal pragmatism. It's that a doctor not only is very useful in any regard, be it a revolutionary situation or not, but also employment is somewhat guaranteed. I can have a livable life, like I can have a decent standard of living. If I'm a doctor, I won't know severe poverty, and that is something of a, I mean, at least I hope I won't, especially compared to the days of 2005 and 2006. But generally what I mean is that it allows for a certain level of security that some other much more interesting, possibly to me, fields do not allow for. I hope that kind of covers the question.
Yeah, it does. Next question comes from PMC, and they want to know, what are your thoughts on Julian Assange?
The WikiLeaks guy? I have not read too much on him. I know that he tried to seek, what's it called? What's it called? Asylum, that's the term. Yeah. He tried to seek asylum in a couple of countries, in Russia and Ecuador and Bolivia and stuff like that. He was recently imprisoned as well. I saw a bunch of the memes, but I honestly have not read too deeply into him, so I'll refrain from commenting.
Okay. Our next question comes from Hackstuck again, and they want to know, what is your opinion on the current situation in, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Xinjiang, China, province with the Uighurs?
Sure thing, that's a very good question. Alright, so my personal perspective is this. There is a... oh my god, this might actually take a little while. I'll give a very quick rundown, and if people want a much more in-depth answer, they can DM me. Basically, what used to occur was, Xinjiang is a sparsely populated and distant province of China, and it's also the most underdeveloped, economically as well as socially. as a result of this, you had certain issues with basically dissatisfaction with the central government, which is understandable when there is not like employment issues and educational issues and whatnot, right? As a result of this, there were certain groups, jihadi groups or Islamist groups, that tried to take advantage of this situation by like recruiting impressionable, that's the word in English, right? Impressionable youth in the area. And as a result of this, the region has suffered from many terrorist attacks over the past 2 decades, even longer, but over the past 2 decades, it's really ramped up. Do your research into this and you'll see. As a result of this, the Central Chinese government realized that they need to do something.
Erdogan.
And what would they do? Would they take the Iraqi strategy? Because in Iraq, we have the exact same issues. Dissatisfaction with employment and education and whatnot causes Islamist groups to take advantage of impressionable youth for their own political ends in Iraq as well. Would the Chinese government take the Iraqi strategy of doing nothing at all and basically allowing them to run rampant, which is what happens here? Would the Chinese administration take the U.S. NATO strategy of bombing them into the Stone Age, which has shown to never work? In fact, it makes things even worse. Or would they try something new? The perspective or the thing that they're trying to do is this. How about they give them proper language training, because they speak a different language, a Turkic language. They don't speak Mandarin. So they give them language training. They give them vocational training so that they can allow them to be properly educated, so that they can enter the workforce and have skills, marketable skills. They give them proper religious guidance with educated imams that would discuss with them why ideas of, like, for example, suicide bombings and terrorism are wrong. They would give them general education, general social education, for example, like education with women, telling them that you don't need to have 6 kids. You don't need to keep trying for sons. Having a daughter is okay. These sort of things. These are certain primitive population or uneducated populations do have these preconceptions. In rural areas in Iraq, this is still very common, for example, as well. So they have them in these vocational centers, because if you're going to go about doing this massive re-education of this group of people, by the way, it's not the entire ethnic group. It's only people who are susceptible, and the way that they are susceptible to or impressionable to radicalization, and that's why the vast majority of the people are men. But also there's some women, but the vast majority are young men. As to use a favorite word of the far right, military age. As much as I don't like that word, but you understand what I mean. It's young men who are impressionable, who have a lot of energy and nowhere to put it. Is what I'm trying to say. And if you want to educate all these people, how do you do it? Do you just do it like on a one-on-one basis? No, it's better to build a proper center that you bring them in, they stay there for a little bit, you give them all this education, then you let them out into the workforce with proper guidance and on and on. And that's what's been happening in Xinjiang. That is what the evidence shows. Now, what the Western media has been portraying is something completely different. They've been saying that there's a genocide. Now, first of all, I would question that premise that there is a genocide, but let's give that precept. Let's assume that something like this is happening. If there was a genocide, where is the evidence for it? Can we take a look at it? Well, yes, we can take a look at it. When you do take a look at all the evidence that's reported on the New York Times and the Washington Post and Reuters and stuff, a lot of it goes back to one guy named Adrian Zenz. Adrian Zenz is a notorious anti-communist Christian fundamentalist who believes that he was sent by God in a crusade against China. He has made many claims based on interviews of sample sizes as small as 8 and 12 people at certain times. He has not been to the region. He has not properly undergone a proper investigation of these things. He has basically made up lies. He has made up things about this. And many Western outlets have reported them without doing any fact check. Now, with all that said, does that mean that the Uighurs or Uighurs, I don't know how it's properly pronounced in English, but it's Uighur in Arabic, are they just hunky-dory? Is everything great for them? No, of course not. They live in a distant province that is incredibly underdeveloped, where they have issues with education, they have issues with social conservatism and just general backwardness. There is an increased police presence in the region because of the past 2 decades of terrorist attacks that have been occurring. Life is not particularly easy for this group of people, but it's not the hellhole that it's made out to be, right? I'm not trying to say that everything's completely fine, but I'm not trying to say also that everything is absolutely, what exists there is not genocide, but an active attempt at weeding out radical or radicalized elements within society in order to prevent the violence that has plagued the region for quite a bit of time. And my perspective as an Iraqi who has to deal with this in Iraq, these sort of issues, I wish such a setup existed in our country, in Iraq. That would make life so much easier and would allow for proper development of the Iraqi youth and their what's the word in English? What they would be capable of doing positively for society, compared to what's happening now, which is you just have a bunch of young dudes who have nothing to do with their time and are very impressionable, end up joining groups that will do them no good, and they end up doing very horrible mistakes that end up with people getting killed. I hope that's a general clarification. If you want further clarification, we can have a much more nuanced discussion on the DMs if you want to. So feel free to message me.
That's a really good answer. Our next one comes from Cozy Pilled Lil Bill, and he wants to know: is Erdogan a fascist?
I think we need to be very careful with our terms. If you want to say he's socially conservative and has certain tendencies of consolidating power in Turkey and has instituted certain policies that may not be exactly in line with what we consider progressive, either economically or otherwise, that would be correct. To call him a fascist outright, I think that it's really diluting the definition of fascism. It's not that I'm scared of calling him a fascist, but I just want to be very specific with our terms. So generally, I would not consider him to be, but you can have a much more nuanced discussion on what he is, which is that one of like a person who has tried to consolidate power, who has put in certain, let's say, negative economic reforms, some negative social reforms. His commentary on certain issues definitely does veer on the yikes side, let's say. But yeah, that's just my general answer about it.
And staying on that kind of topic of Turkey, MM wants to know: what is your opinion of Turkey and Iraqi relations?
They're they're not great, but they're not bad. I don't know. Could you clarify your question further?
I'm actually not completely sure. That's essentially all the question. I don't really know a whole lot about the region specifically. So
no, that's
sorry
fine.
about that.
I meant for the person who wrote the question to clarify. Don't worry.
Oh, okay. They'll probably get back to you in DMs or something. So our next question comes from Tan, and they want to know: was Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956 justified?
That's a very interesting and very complicated question. I want to preface it just by saying, does it really matter? Now that we're in 2021, I don't think so. So this is only for historical interest. But if you do want my answer, it's a yes and a no. Justified in the sense that there was a counter-revolution that was happening after a while. And that did need to be crushed. There's certain aspects, like for example, the drawing of the Star of David over the houses of Jewish people, so fascist mobs can go and murder them. Yeah, that's not a good thing. For example, that's one side of it. On the other side of it, though, the reason the uprising happened was because there were legitimate concerns, and let's say, what's the term in English? Oh my lord! So yeah, this is a moment where my English fails me.
It's okay, take your time.
What's the word in English? Grievances. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. So yeah, the population did have legitimate grievances that were not met, that were not even discussed properly. As a result of this, it got way worse than it needed to. So yes, in the sense that some of the consequences of the uprising were very negative and needed to be dealt with. No, in the sense that there was a politically intelligent way of dealing with the situation without the need for violence and outright invasion. So that's kind of a much more nuanced answer than you're expecting, probably. But yeah,
that's a good answer. We've probably only got time for one or two more questions, just because we are about to hit the 1 hour mark. So the next question comes from the tax collector, and they want to know: would you say where you are from and your background had any influence on your political beliefs?
Sure. Everybody's background and origin has influence on their political beliefs. That's part of materialism, right? The place I'm born in and the society I grew up in definitely has an effect on the way I perceive things around me and my political understanding. My direct experiences with American imperialism are what resulted in me trying to seek out some form of, let's say, explanation of why things are the way they are around me. And that's what led me mainly to socialism, and particularly Lenin and his amazing analysis of imperialism. And also what has driven me to ideas of why socialism is something that's absolutely necessary. So yes, I would definitely say so.
That was a really good answer. Our next question comes from the meme lord, and they want to know: do you believe humans have free will?
Yeah, I would say so. Free will. Yeah.
Okay. And finally, I think to finish off now, we're going to land on a question from Etelex. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. How come Lenin abolished the local Soviets even though he previously wrote positive of them?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. This would take a very long answer, because there's a lot of background information that's necessary, but I'll try to condense it. And if you want further information, then just DM me. Or refer to Edward Carr's excellent Carr, his excellent work on the Russian Revolution. It's in 3 volumes. In the first volume, he discusses the Soviets and their history and what happened with them. It's a very, very good work. But yeah, basically what occurred was the Soviets at the time, and right after the February Revolution, they existed as a form of dual power. That's what their purpose was. They existed as dual power to rival the provisional government. Now, once the revolution was conquered, once it occurred, there's no point in having dual power of workers when the workers are already in government. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So as a result of this, along 2 or 3 things happened. I want to see how I can enumerate this in my head. The first thing was the constitution, the very first constitution, of the Soviet, or of the RSFSR, which was written in 1918 and was ratified in July, I think, March or July, I can't remember. It was ratified in July, but it was being written throughout. It fundamentally reorganized the structure of the Soviets. So instead of having I believe there were 17 or 18 Soviets at the time in 1918, and in order to reorganize the Soviets into a proper administrative structure of the entire nation, so not only to have them these 18 mostly western part of Russia cities, but to have them across the entire all of Russia, and then later on throughout the Soviet Union after it was formally formed in 1922, 1923. So that was the first thing, because there was a constitution that was being ratified at just a couple of months after the dissolution, that fundamentally reorganized the Soviets were set up. That's the first thing. The second thing was the Soviets, as they existed as a dual power organ, after the revolution, they kind of lost their main purpose, because they did not genuinely reflect the demands of the working people. Because of several things. Number one was voter fraud and stuff like that. Because nowadays, even 2020, we have 2021, we have difficulties in counting votes and stuff like that, making sure everything's fair and nice and all that. You can imagine how it was in 1918 in the countryside in Russia after World War I. So as a result of this, so there was that issue, but also most of these Soviets only existed in the western part of Russia, in 17 or 18 cities, like I mentioned before, and didn't rightfully represent the will of the people of at the time, the Russian people, but then later on the Soviet people overall. And the third point that I just kind of want to generally highlight is that this was in the very tumultuous period of right as the revolution was concluding and the civil war was beginning, and having multiple streams of political power and not centralization is incredibly dangerous to a fledgling revolution. To have all these different streams of political power, even though they were technically allied with the central government, to have them just scattered about and not actively directing according to directive of the central government, would result in basically catastrophic problems with the organization of the civil war effort. So it's basically like a perfect storm of, well, there were reforms going in via the constitution of how to have the Soviet system be set up. Factory Soviets and agriculture Soviets go into town Soviets, which go into region and rayon Soviets, which go into governmental Soviets, which go into nation state Soviets, which then go into the Supreme Soviet and the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet nationalities in the Supreme Soviet, excuse me. So that was the first thing, the constitutional. The second thing was the very fact that there were many issues with the existing Soviets, and then the third one was the civil war and the consequences of having a more decentralized approach to power would be dangerous. I hope that kind of clarifies why in a very general way.
Yeah, that was an excellent answer. I think that is unfortunately all we have time for tonight, but I want to thank everyone for their really good questions. Hakim, would you like to make a closing statement for everyone?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you very much for having me on. This was a lot of fun. The questions were very, very good. So thank you guys. I've had actually a migraine the whole day, so I'm sorry that I'm speaking more quietly and I'm not that like on my game or something, or if I misspoke or something. I'm not entirely in it right now. But thank you so much for all the lovely questions, and thank you, Mr. Tom. That was your username, right?
Yeah.
Being such a lovely host and reading out the questions and all that, and helping me organize this because, man, I'm a boomer when it comes to Discord. Nothing fucking works for me. You guys.
Thank you very much for coming on. And sorry to hear you have a migraine. Really impressive to hear how you soldiered through that. But I'm gonna leave a link to Hakim's YouTube channel, everyone, in the announcements page. But for now, if everyone would like to redirect themselves to Politics Voice Chat, that would be great. Thank you, Hakim.
Thank you, baby. Take care.